皆様、こんにちは。本日は国際連合食糧農業機関 FAO チーフエコノミスト、マッシモトレロ氏特別セミナー、世界の食料栄養安全保障及び強靭な食料システム実現のための優先的政策、投資オプションにご参加いただきありがとうございます。今日の司会進行を務めさせていただきます、国際農研ジルカスの飯山と申します。もともと本日のセミナーは、トレロ氏を東京にお迎えし、対面開催が予定されておりましたが、来日が叶わなくなり、急遽開催方法をオンラインに変更させていただくことになりました。会場にお越しいただく予定であった方々には突然の変更となり、ご迷惑をおかけしてしまい、大変申し訳ございません。本日はオンライン開催となりましたが、マッシモトレロ氏の貴重な講演、及び対話の機会を皆様にお届けできればと思います。本イベントは同時通訳がご利用いただけます。通訳ボタンを押してください。ジャパニーズを選択すると日本語でセミナーを聞くことができます。また、講師への質問を Q&A で受け付けております。Q&A をクリックするとポップアップが表示されますので、質問内容を入力して送信をしてください。進行の都合上、当日の質問すべてに対応できない場合もございますので、ご了承ください。それでは始めさせていただきます。まず、国際農研理事長の小山治から開会挨拶となります。
皆様、こんにちは。国際農研理事長の小山です。本日は国際農研、外務省、農林水産省の共催で、国連食糧農業機関 FAO チーフエコノミストであるマシモトレロ氏の基調講演、社にお招きした特別セミナーを開催できることを大変光栄に存じます。急遽予定が変更になりましたけれども、各もたくさんの方々にご参加いただき、誠にありがとうございます。えー今日、世界の食料システムは不確実性のもと、さまざまなリスクに直面しています。数年前には新型コロナウイルス感染症、それから地政学的なリスクの増大を背景に、食料、肥料、燃料の供給分断、供給寸断をもたらして、さらに、食料安全保障が世界の食料システムの安定的な機能に深く依存しているということを思い知らされました。食料システム自体がサプライチェーンを拡大させたり、あるいは食料供給のショックをシステム自らが増幅するということもあります。そして、最も影響を受けるのはいつもすでに気候変動や環境悪化の煽りを受けている食料を輸入する低所得国の人たちです。国連機関が7月に発表した2024年の世界の食料安全保障と栄養の現状、ソフィーですね、というレポートによりますと、世界の栄養不良状態にある人々の割合というのは3年連続で高止まり。そして11人に1人が栄養不良に直面。世界人口の3分の1以上が健康的な食事をとる経済的余裕がないという状況です。SDGs の2番目の目標、飢餓をゼロにという目標がありますけれども、それを達成するためには、食料安全保障の不確実性に対処する。そして、強靭で、持続可能な食料システムを構築する。それらのための革新的、包括的、さらに公平な方策、解決策が早急に必要とされています。皆様ご承知のように、国連食糧農業機関 FAO は、食料安全保障に関する世界的な取り組みを指導する国連専門機関です。トレロ氏はチーフエコノミスト、首席エコノミストですね、として、世界の食料安全保障に取り組む FAO の戦略を指導し、そして監督するという非常に重要な立場にあります。そしてですね、実はトレロ氏と国際農研はかなり以前からつながりがありまして、 国際食糧政策研究所 IFPRI にいらっしゃった頃に、2009年ですけれども、国際農研の国際シンポジウムで基調講演をいただきました。また、昨年は宮崎の G7、農業大臣会合に来ていただいて、意見交換する機会もありました。本日はトレロ氏には早朝なんですけれども、FAO 本部のあるローマから参加いただいております。世界の食料安全保障に対するリスクと現在の食料システムの制約に関してご意見を伺うとともに、これらに対処するための政策、プログラム、どういうものが最適なのかという情報共有をいただけるということで、本当に光栄に思います。それからその後、国際協力機構 JICA 上級審議役の山口博之様、株式会社農林中金総合研究所理事研究員の平沢明彦様にパネリストとしてご参加いただき、世界の食料安全保障と食料システムの強靭性を確保するための重点政策や投資の選択肢についてご議論いただけるということで、心より感謝申し上げます。最後になりましたけれども、農林水産省の久保田様、それから外務省西村様には、日本政府を代表して本イベントの企画運営にご尽力いただきました。本当にありがとうございます。それでは本日どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
小山理事長、ありがとうございました。それでは、農林水産省国際食糧情報特別分析官である久保田治様、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
皆様、こんにちは。そして、máximo toreroさん、おはようございます。えーただいまご紹介いただきましたように、農林水産省の久保田と申します。本日は FAO チーフエコノミストであるmáximo torero氏をお迎えし、このような素晴らしいセミナーを開催することができ、主催の国際農林水産業研究センター、JIRCAS 様にはお礼を申し上げたいと思います。先ほど小山理事長も少し述べておられましたけれども、世界の食料安全保障の状況は一時順調に改善していたと思いますけれども、特に新型コロナウイルス感染症の蔓延を発端として再び悪化してしまい、今は非常にその悪化した状態になっているというふうに思っております。そういった中で、皆様、来週の10月16日は何の日かご存知でしょうか。10月16日は1945年に FAO が創設された日であり、また国連によって制定された世界の食料問題を考える世界食料デーでもあります。はい、今年の世界食料デーのテーマは、食への権利を良い生活と未来のために。
4時半ぐらいかけなって。
で、世界的な飢餓、栄養不足、食料不安に直面している人口の増加といった食への権利という基本的なニーズが満たされない状況に大きくハイライトしています。持続可能な開発目標 SDG2 の理念である誰一人取り残されないという理念のもと、我々は食料栄養安全保障及び強靭な食料システムの実現に向けた早急な対策に迫られております。そのような中で我が国の農業政策について少し申し上げたいと思いますけれども、本年5月に我が国は日本の農政の方向性を示す食料農業農村基本法を制定以来約25年ぶりに改正し、いかなる時も国民一人一人に食料が行き届くよう、平時から食料安全保障に向けて取り組むことを目指しています。また、昨年4月の G7 宮崎農業大臣会合においては、我が国が議長国として、強靭で持続可能な食料システムを構築するためのイノベーションと投資、そして民間セクターや関係者を取り組む重要性を強調しました。 これについては今年、イタリアで先に行われた農業大臣会合でも、その重要性については引き続き強調されておりました。本日はマッシモトレロ氏から示唆に富んだ世界の食料栄養安全保障が直面するリスクや、食料システムが抱える課題についての分析評価、そして政策的な優先事項等が示されることを大変楽しみにしております。本セミナーは当初のような政策を立案する側のみならず、研究、学術機関、民間企業、NGO、NPO、市民社会等、幅広い聴衆に対して有意義なセミナーとなることを記念し、私の挨拶とさせていただきます。ありがとうございました。
久保田様、どうもありがとうございました。それでは本日の主役である FAO チーフエコノミスト、マッシモ・トレロ博士を紹介させていただきます。トレロ博士は、米国カリフォルニア大学ロサンゼルス校 UCLA で経済学修士号及び博士号を取得されております。ご専門は貧困や不平等に関する研究で、地理的要因及び官民資産の重要性に関する分析や、インフラや制度の役割及び技術革新が世帯や小規模農家の福祉をいかに改善するかに基づいた貧困削減政策の在り方について提言を行ってこられました。ラテンアメリカ、サブサハラアフリカ、アジアなど幅広い地域での研究経験を有しておられます。トレロ博士、講演をどうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you so much for inviting me. And first of all, thank you, Dr. Koyama, JIRCAS, for organizing this. And deep apologies, I couldn't be in person with you today, but there were reasons out of my control that didn't allow me to be with you. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to present how we can build resilient agri-food systems given the challenges that we have ahead. And for that, let me start sharing my PowerPoint so that we can move into the presentation. So the title is Building Resilient Agri-Food Systems Given Challenges Ahead. And this will bring a broad logic of where we are today, what are the problems, what we need to do, and how we need to move in the future to achieve this. First of all, let's look at where we are today. Today, we are in a situation that I was mentioned before by Dr. Koyama. Chronic hunger is in 733 million people. This is the latest number that the SOFI publication that was launched in the G20 of Brazil presented. The situation means that we are at the same higher levels that we were in the last 3 years after COVID-19, where we got the highest levels of chronic hunger. So at the global level, we don't see any improvement. Now, if we go and decompose the number within regions, we see that South Asia and Asia remain stable. We see that Latin America improve, specifically South America, reduction of 10 million people out of hunger, mostly run by Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay in South America. In Central America, the situation remained the same as before at high levels, and in the Caribbean islands, it was deteriorated. If we look at Africa, we see a significant deterioration that has been going in the last years, and which will make Africa the country with the highest number of hunger by 2030 if we continue in the same conditions. Second, when we look at regular access to food, what we call people which are food insecure, the number is 2.3 billion people. When we look at access to healthy diets, which is what will allow us to achieve reduce undernutrition and improve the situation of overnutrition, we are in 2.8 billion people, close to a third of the world that doesn't have access to a healthy diet, the minimum cost healthy diet. These three are core indicators, structural indicators that we need to improve to be able to achieve the 2030 agenda. In addition, the short-term measure, which is acute food insecurity, what we use in emergencies, the latest number that we have is 281.6 million people in acute food insecurity. This normally happens in food crisis countries and is the situation of crisis, which normally emergencies will respond. This number is different to the 733 million, which is more structural, is chronic undernourishment. Now, all this is happening in a world where we have economic inequalities, which has been exacerbated as a result of COVID-19, but also in a world where this agri-food system is under three key drivers: conflict, climate, and economic crisis. Conflict has been increasing, not only wars, but conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa has been increasing in the latest years. Climate is affecting the agri-food systems in 5 dimensions: extreme temperatures, lack or excess of water, variability of the climate variables, which makes more difficult for farmers to make a decision on what to produce and when, evolution of pests and diseases, and mobility of people and mobility of species. Those are the dimensions through which climate will affect us today. But then we also have the economic slowdowns and crises, which have affected especially the most vulnerable countries. As you recall, when we had COVID-19, many of these countries had to indebt themselves to be able to buy their vaccines, to be able to keep improving their social protection programs so that they can move and survive the period of COVID-19. This has put many of these countries in debt stress. That means that they have to use most of the capital and resources to pay debt services. But also, they have been affected because of exchange rate devaluation as a consequence of the restrictive monetary policies in developed countries. So when the interest rate is raised in the US, that strengthens the dollar and weakens the currency of these countries because they have very weak central banks. What it means is that most of their food is imported, so they have to pay a food import bill. The prices have increased, so they have a lower capacity of buying what they used to buy before. Second, they get affected because of exchange rate devaluation. And third, they have less resources because of the debt stress. So this is a situation which we are living, and this is a situation which explains why we are facing those challenges today. When we look at the Global Food Crisis Report, which is the one that reports acute food insecurity, which is a short-term measure, we found, as I mentioned before, in 2023, we have around 281.6 million people, or 21.5% of the analyzed population, facing high levels of acute food insecurity in 59 countries or territories. And this graph, this map, shows the situation. The darker blue are the ones in the biggest crisis. Then you have the lighter blue, and then you have even the lighter blue, which are in lower levels. But the important thing to look from this is that for 4 consecutive years, this prevalence, 21.5%, has remained stubbornly high, between 21 to 23%. Despite we have record levels of humanitarian funding by the G7 countries, which normally are supporting reduction of acute food insecurity. But despite that, the number keeps being high. Not only that, 36 countries and territories of the 59, that I was mentioning before, have been appearing in this report for the past 8 years. So 36 countries has been in this report that shows the food crisis countries for 8 years. And this highlights the difficulty of existing acute food insecurity conditions once they become acute. And among those 36, 19 are defined as both protected and major food crisis, meaning in the whole period they have been in this situation. So again, these drivers of conflict, climate change, and slowdowns and downturns are significantly affecting these countries. And this is not something that is happening in 1 year, but it's happening across time. And that's where we need to tackle this major problem. Now, in this context, what is happening in the world? We have the planetary crisis that we are living, especially the climate crisis. Why? Because as you see in the left, we are violating 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, 6 of them. What this means, and where we are extremely concerned, is that the biophysical dynamics could become nonlinear, meaning the speed of problems or frequency of events could become exponential. And the systems have tipping points that we could be overreaching. As a result of that, farmers could be facing in the future a significant increase in the frequency of climate events that will create a significant impact, as I mentioned before, in the 5 dimensions I referred before. Excess of temperatures, lack or excess of water, floods, variability of climate variables, evolution of pests and diseases, and migration of human beings and species. So this is the world that we will be facing in the future. And this is already coming. This is already a reality. In this graph, where you have the 5-year rolling average of daily temperatures anomalies, is the globally daily average temperature anomalies relative to a pre-industrial baseline. You can see that in 2015, we have the first days above 1.5 degrees, which is the benchmark that we don't want to surpass. In 2023, we have the first day above 2 degrees Celsius. And in 2024, 4 consecutive days above 2 degrees Celsius. So this situation, this reality, we are already observing. So we need to be prepared for that. And that's where resilience is so crucial. Because if we don't have the tools necessary to protect ourselves under this increase of frequency of climate events, we will be facing significant challenges and we will be impacting our population. Also, a few months ago, we published a report called Unjust Climate. And what this report shows is that discriminatory social norms and rules affecting women and girls are at the heart of gender inequality, but they are also showing that they are mostly being impacted and they are the most vulnerable to climate stressors. We show in this report that if with the annual heat stress that we are facing, this will reduce total income of females relative to male-headed households in 8%. This implies a $37 billion per year of a cost, increasing the income gap between men and women. Also, if we look at precipitation, extreme precipitation, this will reduce their income in 3% relative to households headed by male. This implies a $16 billion per year. So these climate impacts will exacerbate even more the differences between men and, of course, increase inequalities. We know that a 1% increase on 1 degree centigrade increase in average temperature will affect female relative to male-headed households in 34% of the total income and 24% of their farm income. So the impacts will be significant. Again, this will increase inequalities, and this will make our situation even worse of what we are facing today. So the picture here is very clear. If we don't increase resilience, we are not able to cope better, especially given more tools to female, to minorities, and to the poorest households. They will not be able to cope with the situation that we are facing and the new situation that we will be facing in terms of increase of frequency of climate events. This will increase even more acute food insecurity in the short term, will demand more resources from developed countries, but will in the future, if this is not taken care, increase chronic undernourishment. In a situation where today we are far from reaching the targets that we have for SDG 2. So what do we expect tomorrow, given the current situation? In the current situation, ceteris paribus, we expect that hunger will be at 581.7 million people in chronic undernourishment in 2030. And this could be exacerbated even more if this frequency of climate events that I am explaining will increase. Now, what was the major driver of this significant increase? COVID-19. And COVID-19 increasing 130 million more people hunger in 2030, if we simulate to 2030. So the difference of an scenario with COVID-19 and without COVID-19 is 130 million people by 2030 in chronic undernourishment. So this tells us that we could be better if there was no COVID-19, which was something unexpected, but also tell us that we are far from reaching SDG 2. And this could even be worse because of these climate events and the conflict that we are facing today. So again, it's time to change, and it's time to increase the transformation, and it's time to do something different. The G20 of Brazil this year, and Japan is part of that, has created what we call the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. This global alliance is trying to create a transformation that will help us to minimize this problem of not achieving SDG 2 by reducing hunger. It has 3 pillars: the pillars of knowledge, where we are bringing best practices not only on social protection, in school feeding programs, but also in agricultural products that could give a return in the short term. It has a pillar of financing that looks to increase financing, but also especially looks to coordinate financing so that we can complement what we do with the IFIs, the international financial organizations. But it mainly has this pillar of action at the country level so that we can transform the agri-food systems at the country level. But colleagues, as I mentioned before, we need to increase resilience. And what means to increase resilience? Increasing resilience has two major components. One is to minimize the risks. This is the vulnerabilities. And the second component is to cope with risks when they occur. This is capabilities. What it means to minimize risk. First, we need to build a structure of early warning systems so that we can have the capacity to prevent those risks from occurring. We need to provide a public good to countries where we have early warning systems in place. FAO is currently working in 12 early warning systems, which I will explain later, so that we can provide this information in advance. We need to have predictive power so that countries and farmers know what could be happening to them, and therefore they can get prepared. The second core element is the One Health approach, which has an enormous potential to prevent the emergence of new zoonotic reservoirs. This is exactly targeting problems like COVID-19. We need to avoid this to happen, and this is something that we are working together with the G7 and the G20. And the third element is to increase access to insurance. Insurance that could be to minimize the risk of catastrophic impacts, so what we call catastrophic insurance, which will help to minimize the scenarios of the food crisis countries by being able to have the private sector through reinsurance companies to add value so that not all the pressure goes to develop countries to fund this type of activities. But also we need to keep improving on agricultural insurance, combining this index-based with traditional insurance and access to finance. There is a lot of space of innovation on agricultural insurance today. It's something that we need to keep working, need to create the profiles, the risk profiles, so that farmers can have better access. But one way to do that is to work with parametric insurance, of course, together with traditional insurance, plus adding financing. The best experiences are mechanisms in which, for a bank to give a loan to a farmer, requires that the farmer has an insurance on what they produce. In most parts of the world, insurance are highly subsidized, in developed countries, of course, and in developing countries. But we need to keep innovating so that we can attract more private finance. So that refers to preventive, to be able to minimize the risks before they occur. But on the second component, how we cope with them. If the shock happens, what I do? The first one is to increase absorptive capacity. What is absorptive capacity? A country will be more resilient if it produces more within the comparative advantage, but also if it has more trade partners. The combination of both dimensions will help a country to have more absorptive capacity. Why? Because if a shock happens that affects our production system, you have trade partners from where to import. If a shock happens in one of the countries I was importing, I have more trade partners, but I also have more local production. One clear example of lack of absorptive capacity was what happened with the Ukraine war. The northern part of Africa only imported from Ukraine and didn't have trade agreements with other countries. So when the Black Sea was blocked because of the war, these countries on northern Africa were severely affected because they couldn't import from Ukraine and they didn't have relationship with other countries to be able to attract grain from other parts of the world. Because in those days, there was grain in the world at a higher price, but there was grain in the world. But these countries couldn't be able to import, and it took 6 months to make those trade relationships. So diversity of trade partners is important as diversity of local production. But we need to be careful because when the shock happens in my country and I only produce what I consume, then of course I won't have access to resources. That's why trade is so important as well as local production. The second tool, which is central, is well-targeted social protection programs. We saw during COVID-19 that the reason why Latin America was a lot more resilient to the rest of the world was because they had very developed social protection programs which allow them to respond quickly and minimize these people, the poorest people, to be affected. One of the most important examples was Brazil, which they doubled the social protection, and they were the only country during COVID-19 that they also reduced extreme poverty. So social protection programs have shown to be effective, and that's what we need to expand to other parts of the world. Consumer-centered models to reduce nutrition challenges are also central. We not only need to look at the supply side to assure least cost healthy diets, but we also need to look at the consumer behavior to be able to minimize that. In that context, we need to prioritize investments. And we need to look at the maximum marginal returns and assuring minimizing trade-offs. That's what we show in our roadmap to SDG 2 without reaching the 1.5 degrees. One topic which is essential and which is a triple win is reduction of food loss and waste. Just to have a common definition, food loss goes from the producer to the wholesale market included, and waste from the retail to the consumer. Today, we know that 13% of the global production is lost, and 19% is wasted, according to NEP. Most of the losses occur in the pre-harvest, not in the post-harvest. When our collection of data today shows that a lot happens before even we store. So there is a lot of work that we can do to reduce loss. But on the waste side, we know that most of it occurs at the consumer level, not in the restaurants, not in the retail shops, but at consumer level. And that clearly implies behavioral change. So we need to work intensively, because if we reduce loss and waste, we will use our natural resources better. We will reduce emissions. They are a huge emitter, significant, one of the biggest emitters of methane in the world because of the way food is destroyed by burning it. And we also will reduce the cost of access to healthy diets because there will be more availability of fruits and vegetables where most of the losses occur. We also need to align the incentives by redirecting support to farms in the best way in accordance to the logic of optimizing access to healthy diets. This is the agenda of repurposing of subsidies that we are working with the World Bank, and mostly will impact developed countries. It will have a lower impact in poor countries because the level, relatively speaking, of subsidies is smaller towards developed countries. But in poorest countries, what we understand is we repurpose that through the consumers, through social protection, will have a highest impact. And we did a lot of simulations in the SOFI 2023 so that you can look at those. And finally, trade. People talk a lot about extremes, autarky, like being self-sufficient, what we call food sovereignty, but that won't work alone. We need to look at the continuum, and we need to accelerate trade, especially because understand that we're in a world where the agri-food system will be facing shocks and uncertainty, risk and uncertainty because of climate, because of the conflicts. And in that world, if we don't diversify our sources of food through trade, we will be in a worse situation, in a less resilient situation. So trade, both global and intra-regional trade, will play a crucial role. So let me now deep into what is needed for today in some of these cases. So let me first start with the most vulnerable people, which are the ones which have the highest level of acute food insecurity. And just to put in context, this is the evolution of the volumes of funding that has been requested in the last years. Look at how it has been increasing over time. The money that you are requested to support the most vulnerable through WFP, OSHA, or FAO, OER. But also look at how the gap, the white part of the bar, is increasing over time. Why? Because your countries are facing challenges, and you cannot keep increasing this amount of funding. These gaps means that these agencies cannot afford supplying the transfers and the cash transfers and the social protection that this country needs. And if what I say is correct and the frequency of climate events increase over time, this number will keep increasing. If we look at the total humanitarian funding requested last year was 51.7 billion, and we only got 29 billion, a significant gap. But the other important fact is that what we call anticipatory action only got 137 million. And of that, 53 were disbursed, 54 million. Understand this, anticipatory action is responding to the shock before it happens, meaning I increase resilience. And the smallest amount of money is given to anticipatory action. Most of it is given exposed when the shock already happened, and that's when we distribute the money. It's too late already, when most of our efforts should be in anticipatory action. Just to give you an idea of the returns. So anticipatory action is the resources for actions that can be taken before the impact happens, before the shock happens. The returns are 1 to 7. $1 investment gives 7 of return. Rapid response is when I respond quickly after the shock happened, and the return is 1 to 3. Most of our tools today are not even approaching to rapid response. They are late response. We need to accelerate rapid response, but especially we need to assure that we have anticipatory action. This is central because 55% of the crises are predictable today. We can predict them. Therefore, we need to increase this anticipatory action because it's the one that will give me the highest returns. And we have evidence on this. We have shown this and how this works. Now, in this line, FAO is working with the G7 and WFP and our partners in creating a financing for shock-driven food crisis window, which is exactly the first element of being able to predict the risks. No? This is going to cover 12 risks: drought, tropical cyclone, excess precipitation, flood, earthquakes, pandemics, teleconnections, heatwave, volcano, locust, political risk, and conflict. The blue ones in the right-hand side are the ones that are already insurable, meaning that the reinsurance companies are already working with them. The black ones are ones that are not insurable today, and you need to transfer cash to them when they happen. Our job is to move the blue ones into anticipatory action with the reinsurance company so that we can attract private financing. And this will help to reduce the pressure that your countries are facing to supply food for emergencies, because the reinsurance will kick off and they will pay what is required for anticipatory action. And we need to work on the black ones from 7 to 12 to make them more insurable. For example, locust today, we can predict 6 months in advance, which means that we can insure locust. We are working on conflict too, to be able to increase predictability with Munich Re to try to create insurance for conflict. In political risk, we are working with the IFC, with MIGA from the World Bank to create mechanisms and tools to ensure political risk. So again, there is a lot of progress that can be done. And although our community today of insurance and private sector reinsurance is focused on 3 climate risks, we can expand that to 6. We can develop products that will allow us to be anticipatory to the problem. And we can also reduce the hazards and minimize the pressure over developed countries, because today they cannot continue increasing their budgets for emergencies. The second tool of capacity of absorption is related to social protection programs. And access to social protection programs contributes positively to increasing the productive asset holdings of rural people, increasing the use of improved inputs and farm practices, and shifting away from castle wage labor arrangements and enhanced farmer management practices. The impacts that we have seen are accumulation of productive assets, which increase resilience of farmers, use of improved agricultural inputs and practice, labor allocation and employment effects, income and consumption levels, intergenerational impact and social mobility, especially through conditional cash transfers that assures that our kids are educated and vaccinated, reduction of gender inequality because most of the transfers normally goes to the female household head, environmental sustainability, resilience to shocks, and also the social protection produces multiplier effects at household and local income levels. Those are all the benefits that we know and where we need to work on. But what is the situation today on social protection? Despite their relevance, these programs often have too low coverage, especially among the poorest rural households. Roughly 50% of the poorest income quintile has no access to social protection. However, social protection coverage gap among the poorest rural population significantly varies. 86% in low-income countries, 50% in low-middle-income countries, 25% in upper-middle-income countries, and 8% in high-income countries, between 2010 and 2019. This is in the left figure that you have in the PowerPoint. It is also important to note that 85% of the low-income countries are from Sub-Saharan Africa. You can see this in the right-hand side, which means that the continent which is facing the biggest challenge does not have a system of social protection developed. And that's where the learning from Brazil, from Latin America, can be increasingly good for this continent. That's the way we need to bring this global alliance to create South-South learning so that they can improve their social protection. Also, the average per capita transfer among program beneficiaries in PPP dollars of 2011 is consistently lower in rural areas than in urban areas. The average per capita transfer in rural areas in low-income countries and low-middle-income countries is $0.3 and 0.7 respectively. These values represent a small fraction, less than 15% of the transfer recorded in high-income countries, which is $4.9. In low-income countries, the average transfer is equivalent to 15% of the international poverty line, which is 1.90, and 10% of the healthy diet cost, which is $2.7 in 2011 PPP dollars. In low-middle-income countries, the transfer roughly represents 23% of the international poverty line and the cost of a healthy diet. So social protection in Sub-Saharan Africa, as I said before, and you can see this in the right-hand side graph, only covers around 45% of the total population in all regions except in Sub-Saharan Africa. Close to 3/4 of the population in Sub-Saharan Africa is not covered, and around 20% of the population benefits from social assistance programs only. So big challenge in this last bar for Sub-Saharan Africa, where we can significantly improve in the future. Not only that, in low-income countries and low-middle-income countries, spending on direct transfers is low on average, and it is dwarfed by spending on subsidies. Relatively speaking, of course, no? The figure that you can see compares spending on energy and agricultural subsidies with all social protection spending. In high-income countries, spending on social protection far exceeds spending on subsidies. In upper-middle-income countries, spending on energy and agricultural subsidies is equal to the spending on social protection, the second two green bars that you have in the graph in the right-hand side. When we move to low and middle-income countries and low-income countries, social protection spending is significantly less. The light green bar is significantly less than the spending, relatively speaking. This is a share of percentage of GDP, because, of course, in absolute levels, the numbers of developed countries is significantly higher. Only 20% of spending on subsidies reaches the bottom 40% of each country, and combined with low spending on transfers means that there is little compensation for the reduction of income and consumption brought about by indirect taxes. Subsidies are widespread, but they are inefficient because they are not targeting properly. And as you can see in the graphs in the right-hand side, the blue line is the increase on subsidies, of course, a share of the benefits, and you see that there is a significant increase while social protection, cash transfers is lowering, and the impact is significantly lower, especially in the low-income countries in Africa and in the lower quintiles. So there is a lot of work to improve in social protection. Let me now move to the investment, to prioritization of investments. And we have designed two ways of measuring this through the marginal cost curve that we have developed. So the MAC for hunger shows that the cost of each hunger reduction measure that you have in the different colors that are represented by the bars. A single intervention is a bar. For example, dark blue is ICT technologies. Brown is school feeding programs. So this bar shows that the width is represented by the number of individuals being lifted out of hunger. The height of the bar is associated to the annual per capita cost, and the area is associated to the total annual cost. The total width of the MAC affects the total hunger reduction possible from all interventions, while the sum of the areas of all the bars represents the total annual cost of reduction hunger through implementations of all of these interventions. The position of the bars in this graph along the MAC curve reflect the order of each intervention by their cost effectiveness based on annual per capita cost. When moving along the MAC curve left to right, the cost effectiveness of the intervention worsens and the next intervention becomes more expensive than the preceding. For example, in this graph, we can see that the most cost-effective intervention in the short term, so between 2025 and 2030, will be digital technologies, followed by school feeding programs, and followed by emergency response and, of course, social protection. Those are the core interventions that will have a significant impact of reduction in hunger in the short term. Diseases, trade also will have an impact or will be less cost-effective, relatively speaking. And nutrition interventions are significantly more expensive. So these are the investments in the short term that we can do. That's exactly the focus of the Global Alliance in the short term, how we can reduce this. But the question now is what we can do tomorrow, how we can work tomorrow. Why is this so important? Because if we compare the studies that are already published, the one is the CERES 2030 that was published a couple of years ago, this shows the billions that are required, are more than 300 billion in 6 years to reduce and achieve as much as possible SDG 2, or a frequency of around 150 billion to be able to do that. And here we separate what means empowered excluded, social protection mostly, on the farm productive projects, which is the red, and food on the move. Now, clearly, if we look at today, where the time span is smaller, the cost has increased substantially. But also, when we incorporate the concept of systems, which is what we did in 2023, Sophie, we see that the impact is significantly higher and the needs are significantly higher. We are talking of more than $500 billion that are required a year to eliminate hunger. Now, if we tie these investments again to prioritization of investment, following the same logic of this Marx curve, but more looking at the impact from 2025 to 2040, we see that agricultural extension services, agricultural research and development, and ICT are here the productive projects, the research that takes longer to have an impact becomes the more profitable investments in the long term. So it's really important to look at short-term interventions for the short period of years that we have until 2030. And what we need to do in the medium and long term, the interventions will be different. And they will here bring returns in the long term to reduce chronic undernourishment. Those long-term interventions, medium-term interventions, are the ones that will smooth out the requirement of flow of money over time to reduce hunger. Now, why is this so important? And the lemma that we bring today in FAO and what we are going to discuss in the birthday of FAO is good food for all for today and tomorrow. What this means? It means that the agri-food system provides the food for today. We eat today. And we want good food, which means we want access to healthy diets. And we always forget that agri-food system provides the right to food. And when we go to any COP, the only thing we hear about agriculture is it creates externalities. It affects the environment because of emissions, the climate, because of emissions. 1/3 of the emissions come from the agri-food system. It affects biodiversity because it destroys biodiversity when we expand land. It affects the use of water and land. That's the only thing we hear. But we forget that it brings the agri-food system, brings the right to food. If people don't eat, we can have an amazing planet, but without people. So we need to recognize the importance of the agri-food system. And the climate efforts, the climate financing, should reorient towards agri-food systems. There are two sectors that is affecting climate: energy and the agri-food systems. Energy is starting to fix itself through the reconversion of generation. But the agri-food system still is producing this enormous amount of externalities, as well as the right to food. Of course, we need more food production. And for that, we need to bring these two objectives together. We need to build an agri-food system that is efficient and also better distribution of the food in the world. That's what we call the just transition. But that requires financing. And the problem is that most of the climate financing does not go to agricultural systems. Only 4% of the agricultural financing, climate financing, goes to the agri-food system, when it's the sector that provides the right to food and is the sector that has the biggest space to improve and reduce emissions. Just for example, reduction of food loss and waste. 8% of emissions will be reduced. So again, we need to rethink and change the way we are doing. And that's what we try to do in this roadmap, where you can scan the QR code to get a publication of SDG 2 without breaching the 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we are bringing the two objectives: achieving right to food, plus avoiding, we breach the 1.5 degrees. This means we produce more with less. We are more efficient, and we improve redistribution of food, the just transition concept. This is central because this is what will allow us good food for all for today and tomorrow. Now, if you look at the graph, the red line is the projection of where we need to be able to achieve eradicating hunger. We want to achieve it in 2030 and keep it there in less than 5%. But to be able to do that, we also need to improve what we call access to healthy diets. That for sure is not an SDG indicator for 2030, but that's where we need to be able to do that. And the yellow line is people that could not afford a healthy diet, the yellow trend. So we are targeting that for 2050. At the same time, it's not only that they are able to afford, but they also access to healthy diets, and that's the red line. So less people, despite they can afford access to healthy diets. Now, this will require that the agri-food system will have to reduce its emissions, that's the dotted green line, so that we can also convert the agri-food system into a carbon sink and preserving the planetary biodiversity. That's the dark green line. So those are the projections that we need to have in place to achieve these goals. And the roadmap is bringing the actions that countries need to look at to be able to achieve that. Because remember, climate impacts are global. It's not what I do as a country, it's what the whole world does as a country. So this is the only thing that will allow us to eradicate hunger, don't breach the 1.5 degrees, and use agri-food systems to be a carbon sink and preserving the planetary biodiversity. So you can review those actions in that plan. But one of the core elements is financing, as I mentioned before. And the SOFI of this year brought in the second part, how we can finance the agri-food systems. And the first thing that we found is that there is an issue of definition. Why? Because it's not only food consumption, what we call the dimensions of food security, availability, access, utilization, and stability, but it's also the health status, practices and health services, and environment of health. Why? Because I can provide food to you, but if you have a diarrhea, all the food that I give you, all the micronutrients will go out. So health and food needs to be together. Secondly, when we look at this definition, we need to be sure that we bring all the concepts, all the drivers, conflict, climate variability, economic slowdowns, lack of access to healthy diets, so that these major drivers are resolved structurally through these investments. And for that, we have to define pathways. That's what we produce and bring up in the SOFI this year. Now, in the SOFI, also look at the different levels of ability to access to financing. In green, you have the high ability to access to financing. In yellow, moderate ability. And in red, limited ability to finance. Clearly, green are high-income countries and high middle-income countries. They can access to sustainable, low debt, and they can access to finance. Moderate financing are most middle-income countries, and the ones that we focus most is the limited ones of access to finance. Why? Because they are facing debt stress, as I explained before, and they are mostly the low and low-income countries. And 74% of all of these countries are affected by one or more of the drivers. So we need to innovate. And let me just focus here on the red box, which is the countries that have limited finance. The first element is, of course, grants like IDA with the World Bank, but also low or no interest loans. Here is where we need to work on that. We also need to reallocate funds for food security and nutrition. One way is using the SDRs so that we can reallocate some funds with clear indicators of improvement of reduction of food insecurity, or debt swaps, or special lending rights. But again, we need to bring insurance, parametric insurance, risk pools, and first loss. These are the countries that most of the help is needed. The green countries, they can handle themselves. And the yellow will need some help, but we need to improve through sovereign bonds, health taxes, and other tools that could allow them to access. But our focus has to be on this red box, because that's the only way we will improve these countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which are facing such challenges today. So colleagues, let me summarize with what I think is the whole essence of this presentation. Clearly, we need to transform our good agri-food systems with greater resilience to make them sustainable and inclusive while ensuring healthy diets are affordable. It requires building early warning systems, absorption capacity, and recovery mechanisms. This will require to integrate humanitarian development and peace-building policies because conflict has been increasing over time. We need to protect the households and value chains during economic slowdowns. These are resilient tools to the value chain production. We need to improve efficiency, produce more with less, and scale up climate resilience across agri-food systems. And we need to address specific challenges associated with water management. Water will be one of the major stressors that will be behind increasing conflict. We need to improve also on value chains that contribute to healthy diets by reducing food loss across the value chain, but also reducing waste and improving the productivity and efficiency of those value chains. I am referring to fruits and vegetables. And this is linked to the realignment of public expenditures and the support to agriculture so that we can assure more access to healthy diets in a sustainable agri-food system. All these will require better policies and investment. Investment will be central, but we need to prioritize that investment, as I explained before, in these agri-food systems by reducing the hidden costs, the externalities, without increasing families' expenditures on food. So this is the transformation that we need. And I hope with the new political momentum that we have through the Global Alliance, what the Food Security Group is doing in the G7, all together we can work in achieving this goal, which is so important today and which will benefit all of us in the world. Thank you so much.
トレロ博士、洞察に満ちたご講演ありがとうございました。それでは博士の講演に対してオンラインの参加の皆様から質問を受けたいと思います。